The sun blazed over the wilderness, casting long shadows across the desert floor. It had been years, decades, since the Israelites left Egypt. Years of wandering, years of waiting, years of weariness, and now once again the people complained. They were thirsty, they were angry, they turned on Moses. "Why did you bring us out of Egypt just to die in the wilderness?" they cried. "There's no water, there's nothing here." And for Moses, it was the same song again, the same accusations, the same frustrations, the same cycle of rebellion, entitlement, and forgetfulness. These were the people he had led through the Red Sea, the people who had seen manna fall from heaven and water gush from a rock before. And yet here they were, doubting, blaming, turning on the man who had interceded for them more times than they could count. Moses turned to God, just as he had done so many times before, and God, faithful as always, responded with clarity. "Take the staff, gather the assembly, you and your brother Aaron. Speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. Speak to the rock." That's all. Not strike it, not shout at the people, just speak. But something in Moses snapped. Maybe it was the years of pressure. Maybe it was the endless complaining. Maybe it was the weight of being the leader of a people who constantly looked back instead of forward. So Moses took the staff, he gathered the people, and he didn't just speak to them, he scolded them. "Listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock?" And then he struck the rock. Twice. Water still flowed. The people still drank. Their thirst was quenched, but heaven had fallen silent, because in that moment Moses had stepped out of obedience and into anger. He had taken a divine instruction and filtered it through human frustration, and God saw. He always sees. Later, God would speak again, not in rage but in sorrow. "Because you did not trust me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them." The words must have crushed Moses. After all the years of faithfulness, after the countless battles and intercessions, after standing in the gap time and again, this moment of anger would cost him the promised land. It seemed severe. But God was making something clear. Leadership without reverence leads to misrepresentation. Moses wasn't just a man, he was God's representative before the people. And in striking the rock, he had painted a picture of God that wasn't true. God wasn't angry, God wasn't condemning, he was ready to provide with a word. But Moses, in his fury, misrepresented God's heart. Before we go further, if this story is resonating with you, I invite you to support this podcast. If you've ever wrestled with frustration, leadership fatigue, or the weight of responsibility, take a moment to like this episode. Leave a comment with your thoughts, share it with someone walking through the wilderness, and subscribe for more Bible-centered reflections. Your support helps this message reach more people who need to hear the truth. Now back to Moses. This moment reminds us that even the greatest leaders are still human. Moses was called, anointed, empowered, but not immune to weakness. His temper didn't make him a failure, it made him real. But it also served as a caution. Emotions are powerful, and when they go unchecked, even righteous anger can lead us off course. It's not that God doesn't understand our frustration, he does, but when we allow frustration to override obedience, we risk turning a divine moment into a personal reaction. For Moses, it wasn't just about striking the rock, it was about trust. God asked him to speak, to show the people that provision didn't require force, that grace didn't need to be coerced, that the God who had led them with fire and cloud was still gentle enough to respond to a whisper. Moses missed that moment, and in doing so, he missed the opportunity to show God's holiness to a generation that desperately needed to see it. There's something deeply sobering in this story. Moses had been the mediator, the miracle worker, the voice of God's authority, but in one moment of misdirected anger, he became the example of what happens when obedience gives way to emotion. Still, God didn't abandon Moses. He didn't revoke his love or erase Moses from his story. In fact, the Bible goes on to describe Moses as the greatest prophet Israel had ever known, one whom God knew face to face. That's important, because while Moses missed the promised land, he didn't miss God. Our mistakes may carry consequences, but grace means they don't define us. Moses continued to lead with strength. He continued to intercede, to teach, to prepare the next generation. His failure didn't end his story, it just reshaped its conclusion. And perhaps that's a word for someone listening. Maybe you've had a moment like Moses, a moment where anger overwhelmed obedience, a moment where your emotions got the best of you, a moment where you misrepresented God to others or even to yourself. Don't let that moment become your identity. Learn from it, grow from it, but don't stop walking with God. Moses didn't. In fact, on the Mount of Transfiguration, centuries later, when Jesus was revealed in his glory, who was standing beside him? Moses. He reached the promised one, even if not the promised land, because grace restores what failure won't. This story is a mirror. It reflects the tension between leadership and humanity, between calling and character, between obedience and emotion. And it reminds us that God cares deeply about how we represent him, not because he's insecure, but because people see him through us. When we lead with anger, people think God is angry. When we react with frustration, people assume that's how God responds. But when we speak with gentleness, even when we're tired, even when the people are complaining, even when the pressure builds, we reveal a God who is near, patient and kind. That's what God wanted Moses to show. That's what he wants us to reflect today. You don't need to strike the rock, you only need to speak, because the rock, Christ himself, has already been struck once for all. And now living water flows not through force, but through faith. Let that settle in your heart. Your words carry weight, your actions reflect God. So speak with reverence, lead with humility, and even when you're frustrated, trust that God is still working through your obedience, not your intensity. This is the story of the day Moses lost his temper, and the God who remained faithful through it all. It's easy to judge Moses from a distance, but anyone who has carried the burden of leadership knows the strain he felt. The people didn't see the private prayers, the nights without sleep, the tears shed when they rebelled. Again, they saw only the man with the staff. And sometimes leaders break under the pressure of being strong for everyone else, but God doesn't ask for perfection. He asks for trust. He asks for hearts that remain soft even under pressure, for voices that still listen even when frustrated, for obedience that goes deeper than emotion. Moses had seen the face of God on Mount Sinai. He had received the tablets of the covenant. He had stood in the gap when God was ready to start over with another nation. And yet, in his humanity, he stumbled. This is not the story of a perfect leader. It's the story of a faithful God working through imperfect vessels. And that's good news for us, because we too are prone to let frustration speak louder than faith. We too are tempted to act out when obedience feels too slow. But this story reminds us God's ways are higher. His holiness is not just displayed in fire and thunder, but in the quiet moments of reverent obedience. The wilderness tested Moses, and it will test us. But if we listen, if we speak when he says speak, and trust when he says trust, we will see his provision flow, not by force, but by his faithfulness. So today, whether leading a family, a team, or your own heart, remember the lesson from that desert day. You don't have to strike, you only need to trust. Let your leadership reflect peace over power, intimacy over intensity, and in doing so, you will reflect the heart of a God who provides water in the wilderness with just a word. This is the story of the day Moses lost his temper, and the God who still used him to lead his people home. Moses' story ends not with entry into the promised land, but with a view from a mountaintop. From there, God allowed him to see the land he had led others toward, but would not enter himself. That scene is powerful. A leader standing on the edge of fulfillment, not with bitterness, but with peace. Because legacy is not always about arrival, it's about faithfulness on the journey. He had done what he was called to do, and in God's mercy, Moses was honored, remembered, and lifted up, even in failure. The lesson is not to walk in fear of failure, but to walk in reverence, to let every instruction from God be met, not with assumption, but with attention, not with reaction, but with reflection. You may never stand before a literal rock in the desert, but you will face moments where emotion tempts you to override God's instruction, where frustration invites you to act before listening, where your heart wants to strike instead of speak. In those moments, remember Moses. Remember the power of a word spoken in obedience. Remember that leadership is a sacred trust. And remember most of all that God is faithful even when we are flawed. He doesn't discard those who stumble. He redeems them. So walk humbly, lead wisely, speak carefully, and trust deeply, because in doing so, your story, like Moses, can still reveal the holiness of God. Thank you for listening.